Good morning, good afternoon, good late afternoon, wherever you are. Welcome to the 13th Asia-Euro People's Forum. Since 1996, the Asia-Euro People's Forum has been organizing events for social movements and NGOs in both Asia and Europe to participate in. And for this morning, we will be hosted by Hamid, Geo News Capital Talk host, and also Hilary Wainwright, the editor of Red Pepper and a fellow at Transnational Institute. My name is Dorothy Guerrero from the International Organizing Committee. So over to you, Hamid and Hilary.
Thank you very much. Welcome to all, and good afternoon, because here is the afternoon in Pakistan, and good morning to all those who are enjoying the fine morning. And welcome to AEPF13. This is the 13th biennial conference of the Asia-Europe People's Forum. For the first time, this conference is being organized in a virtual way. So it's a new experience, and we hope that this experience will be a great success. The Asia-Europe People's Forum is an international network of progressive civil society organizations from across Asia and Europe. It is committed to fostering people's solidarity for a socially and economically just, inclusive, peaceful, sustainable, and ecologically sensitive development within and across the two regions. We hope and are sure that AEPF13 will be an exciting event with a series of interlinked dialogues, workshops, actions, policy debates, and plenary sessions. The outcome of this conference in the form of a final declaration will be presented to the 13th Asia-Europe meeting, where heads of the states from Asia and Europe will have discussions on future priorities and plans. During these 8 days, we will have a range of sessions on major themes which represent AEPF's hopes for citizens of Europe and Asia. And these are 6 major themes: climate justice and just transitions, food sovereignty and resource justice, trade justice and corporate accountability. It's very important. Social justice and social protection, peace and security, and participatory democracy, human rights, and migrants' rights. And all sessions of AEPF13 will be recorded and made available to the AEPF website, which is www.aepf.info. And now over to my co-moderator, Hilary Wainwright.
Okay, Hamid, thanks. And welcome everybody again. And just to say how wonderful and fantastically important it is that APF is here. I mean, it always seems that APF is ready when there's a crisis. My most vivid memory is in Beijing, just in the midst of the financial crisis. You know, when APF was able to respond very dramatically with a whole program of what is to be done. I think we called it Beijing Nights or something, because we were working right into the night preparing this this plan, especially led by Walden Bello. So again, you know, here the APF it's persisted. So big congratulations to Dottie and TNI and everybody who's been involved in organizing this. But it's facing multiple crises, both continuing financial crises and the continuing financialization and privatization of everything that lives, you know, including our own personal lives, and the consequences of that for people is increasingly dire. And in a way, the pandemic has revealed this. So there's the financial crisis, the health crisis. You know, it's not going to be just this pandemic, but many, and then the environmental crisis and the food crisis, and the speakers reflect all this. But we're going to begin with a contribution from Shui, the widow of Sombath, a very valued comrade of the APF, who was the co-organizer of the APF in 2009 in Laos, and very soon after that was kidnapped and by the Laos government, who obviously saw him as a threat, which indeed he was. He was organizing poor people and empowering them in many different ways. I mean, collaboratively, and Shuming will say more about the situation, but this is a very important moment. So over to you, Shuming.
Thank you. Good day to everyone. And this is the fourth time I have addressed an AEPF. And to say and to tell the truth, it really does not give me a lot of pleasure to keep talking about Sombath. He has been now missing for about 9 years. But let me share my thoughts with you. 9 years have passed since Sombath was abducted right in front of the police post, with the act of abduction caught on CCTV. Yet the Laos government has kept up the charade and denied any knowledge of what happened to him. And while at the same time not doing anything to conduct any thorough or transparent investigation. Over the past 9 years, I have traveled the globe, giving countless talks about Sombath. I have knocked on the doors of world leaders, representatives of United Nations, and appealed to almost all international and regional human rights organizations, and appealed to them to help pressure the Laos government and officialdom to give me answers of what happened to Sombath and return him safely to me and my family. Unfortunately, up to today, I still have no answers. I only have a wall of silence and lies from the officialdom. In fact, with the passing of time, the smear campaign against Sombath has become more vicious. He is accused of amassing a huge amount of wealth in a dubious way. And this caused me a lot of pain and a lot of despair. But nonetheless, I feel that I cannot opt for doing nothing. I cannot opt for despair, because to despair would be everything the perpetrators want. And to lose hope, I feel, is to lose a part of my dignity, my humanity, and my love for Sombath. For this reason, despite my despondency, I've decided to come once more to talk to the panel and the participants of the 13th AEPF. Maybe with hope, the case will be resolved before the convening of the next AEPF. I mean, at the AEPF, many of you know Sombath. Many of you know his work, and many of you also have worked with him in the region for many years, promoting a people-centered development agenda, a development that would benefit all and not just the corporations or the rich. A development which would put people at the center of the development process. A development which would enhance people's rights and access to democracy. Sombat, throughout his work and throughout his life, has advocated that. And he has tried to work so hard inside Laos, with communities, with families, to show how the development process need not be only enriching those in power, but it can be a process where the fruits of everyone's labor can be fairly shared. He did that. He also tried to promote that very strongly at the 9th AEPF. He always said many of our development problems that we face are due to past and present day wrong development strategies, wrong development processes. And indeed, today we see, today's world, we are suffering the consequences of many of these wrong policies and wrong strategies. We have seen violence increase. We have seen disenfranchisement increased. We have seen the worst widening of the wealth gap between the rich and the poor. We have seen also the kind of environmental degradation, destruction, never actually seen in human history. And we are still going down that slippery slope. Somebody, if he were with you today, would have, I think, a lot of things to say and a lot of things to contribute to this AEPF. He would probably urge all of us to think outside the box, to come up with new ideas and also new solutions for the problems we face today. The fact that today we face the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, is actually the consequences of some of these misplaced development policies and strategies. The fact that we cannot meet face to face, the fact that we have to be locked down, the fact that we have to meet through Zoom meetings, the fact that we have to see our kids learn online, the fact that so many people have lost their jobs and so many small businesses have closed, I think is one of the consequences of many of these misplaced development processes and strategies we have followed in the past. So today, I think we have yet another opportunity to meet, to network, to reach out for greater degree of solidarity in the way we do things, support one another in order to strengthen our resistance. This is why I find the title of the AEPF, Resistance, Solidarity, and Networking, so appropriate. So in closing, I want to thank the organizing committee of AEPF once more for giving me the space to speak again. And I want to wish everybody very, very fruitful discussions in the next couple of days. Thank you.
Thank you. Harry,
inspiring contribution. And I think we all give great solidarity and are determined to keep the ideas and creativity and commitment of Sombath alive and very much part of the inspiration of the APF. So thank you. That's been a very important introduction to our thinking and discussion today and the rest of the week. So bearing all that you've said in mind, we're going to move now to say Sam Kham from Myanmar, which has obviously been in the forefront of our minds and their struggle for democracy. Say Sam is a well-known activist and leader in Myanmar and fighter for democracy. He was for many years the director of the development NGO Meta, and he's currently doing his PhD in Europe. Anyway, so Sam, welcome, and we're really interested in what you're saying because what's happening in Myanmar is such an important struggle.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me here. I'd like to give my update about what is going on in Myanmar. Dear distinguished guests, friends, comrades around the world, Mingalaba, my warmest greetings to you all. Thank you for having me here. My dear Shui Meng, my heart bleeds for you and Sombath. Your friends from Myanmar never forget Sombath and the kindness and great courage you have shown us. May all the foes disappear and case God justice. Today, people from Myanmar stand in solidarity with all oppressed people around the world who suffer from injustice. We stand with Rohingya brothers and sisters and with the Military Alliance. We stand with the Uyghurs, Palestinians, Syrians, Colombians, Ethiopians, and the grassroots movements against systemic racism. My prayers also go to India and many other countries suffering from the COVID-19 pandemic. Myanmar has paid a hefty price and learned that no person is an island. We now know that we are not alone. We all are connected. We will help each other and we will win. Since the attempted coup d'etat, 796 people have been killed and over 5,000 arrested. Myanmar military committed systemic gross human rights violations, including arbitrary detention, extrajudicial killing, torture, extortion, sexual violence, and looting. Families were asked to pay money to retrieve their dead bodies. The junta did that because violence, theft, and corruption is the only way of governance they know. However, Myanmar people show unabated defiance through peaceful protests, civil disobedience movement, and boycotting military businesses. Some young people resorted to violence and some had joined armed movements, but the conflict is asymmetrical and disproportionate. The military junta repeatedly bombarded Chin, Kachin, and Karen state using heavy artillery, fighter jets, and helicopter gunships. As a result of these offensives, tens of thousands of civilians are displaced, several hundreds wounded, and some killed. Military coup in 1962 and 1988 rendered Myanmar from one of the most prosperous countries in Asia to a pauper, begging for international aid and burdening neighboring countries with refugees and immigration crises. There is no reason to believe the promise of a military orchestrated, free and fair democratic election when they don't even recognize the 2020 election, which is widely accepted as fair. Nacpil revolution has brought a political awakening across the country and a unity Myanmar has never seen before. Youth and women are taking the center stage. Many people have apologized to ethnic and religious minorities, including the Rohingyas, for their action in the past or for discriminating against them. Patriarchy and religions are being challenged. Some Myanmar people are questioning what role Buddhism probably plays in the social reproduction of dictatorship and Burma nationalism. I take these signs as progress for future democratization in Myanmar. Myanmar people unanimously support the National Unity Government as their sole legitimate government. They regard the coup council as an occupying alien force that should be eliminated from the political and social life of Myanmar once and for all. NUG is a work in progress and there is room to improve. Myanmar has never seen such diverse government with representatives from diverse ethnicities, genders, and inclusion of young leaders. We also see the first ever out and proud LGBTQ minister. For the international governments who identify themselves with democracy and freedom, we need your urgent support now. Please officially recognize NUG as Myanmar's sole legitimate government. Myanmar people will not take no as an answer. Over 4 decades, the same military has targeted the Rohingya people, perpetrating what some call a slow-burning genocide. In 2017, the coup leader, General Min Aung Hlaing, commanded a politically calculated operation to address what he called an unfinished business. He and his military brutally attacked, killed, and expelled 700,000 Rohingyas to Bangladesh. Children were thrown alive into fire. Women and children were raped. Hundreds of villages were torched to the ground. Directly or indirectly, NLD government was also complicit in this heinous crime. If Myanmar wants to move forward as a peaceful and democratic country, we need to end the culture of impunity and establish justice and accountability for everyone, including for the Rohingyas. The NUG government should publicly apologize to those who are being oppressed during their tenure. NUG must ensure a path for reparation and transitional justice. The racist 1982 citizenship law must be abolished. Now we can clearly see that the NLD strategy of talking sense to the murderous military or reconciliation with them without taking justice and accountability into account has failed again and again. That's why we have zero trust and zero tolerance to the soft diplomatic approach of ASEAN and the UN Special Envoy. Please enlighten us. Did Europe get rid of Hitler and Nazism through peaceful negotiations alone? How did Bosnian genocide end? Please acknowledge that Myanmar people have full rights to defend themselves. NUG as a legal government has a full right to establish its Ministry of Defense and to arm itself. The UN and the Security Council allowed genocide to happen in Myanmar while it received all the early warnings that it is, and still it utterly failed to stop the genocide. If the Security Council cannot fulfill its mandate, then what is the point of its existence? All we were told is to be patient and to try using non-violence resistance, while the junta, armed to its teeth, used their latest cache of weapons and surveillance technology supplied by global arms trade, including from Russia, China, India, Austria, Sweden, Belgium, and Israel. That's a disgrace. Global capital without due diligence ended up bankrolling the junta. Oil and gas giant Total funds the junta through their massive offshore gas fields. Dutch pension funds ABP and PGGM, for example, are funding the Myanmar military through their investment. Please help us stop this madness. We need a global arms embargo and coordinated economic sanctions to stop the evil terrorist junta from growing. Global corporate must immediately cut ties with the Myanmar military. Myanmar military must be referred to the ICC. Please help us deliver this. To conclude, I would like to quote poet Kathy from Shui. Being a fierce critic and a protest leader, he was brutally murdered. In one of his defiant verses, Kathy wrote, "I don't want to be an elite politician, nor a dreamy poet. I don't want to be complicit in injustice. If I have only 1 minute left to live, I want to live that full minute with a clear conscience." In another verse, he wrote, "They shot our heads because they don't know that revolution lives in our heart." With that, I would like to send a message to all the tyrants, authoritarian, military dictators, and evil monarchy around the world that their time is up, that they cannot stop the young people from seeking democracy, justice, and freedom. Long live the revolutions. Nui U revolution will win. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sassam. And I think, you know, what you said is a huge challenge and indictment of existing governments, including the governments across Europe. So this is a key issue for the APF to take forward and to pick up your challenge. So solidarity, but also commitment to work and campaign on behalf of the movement in Myanmar. First, I must just say that the attendance at this webinar is growing by the minute. So at the moment it's 266 and growing. I can see the numbers constantly increase. So could everybody that's coming in, could you just introduce yourself in the chat so that we have a sense? Unfortunately, we can't hug each other, but at least we can know that each other is there. So next, Hamid and I have a huge pleasure in introducing Vandana Shiva. I think I remember speaking or sharing being on the same platform as her, even maybe 20 years ago. I mean, she is an incredibly far-sighted and committed intellectual, and a real example of a public intellectual, a global public intellectual, who's been warning us about the threat to the planet long before it became, a sort of, well, I wouldn't say fashionable, but kind of, the issue of the day. So Vandana, it's wonderful to have you here and to hear your voice, and a huge thank you and congratulations for all your work. And it's great that the AEPF is giving you a platform. So over to you, Vandana.
Thank you, Hilary. Good to see you after all these years. And to all the friends on the panel and everyone who's listening. My solidarities to Myanmar, to Palestine, to Colombia. Show me a place where there is not a small or big revolution taking place. It's just that some of them don't become big enough to make the news. And in any case, in a period of controlled news and paid news, so many of the real revolutions never get reported. I send you the solidarity from an India in pain herself. The pain of COVID, we had just 10 deaths when all this started a year ago. And now it's 4,000 a day. And probably the most impacted, because I could never have imagined that I would see in my lifetime, people die for lack of oxygen, the most foundational need for being alive. And then we've been hit by a cyclone. I've witnessed many cyclones since the climate havoc started, but most of them are in the Bay of Bengal. The Arabian Sea is a very peaceful sea, but right now, Cyclone Totke is attacking Kerala, Karnataka, Goa, Maharashtra. Dozens have died. Villages have been uprooted. So we have the COVID pandemic, we have the climate havoc pandemic, we have chronic disease pandemic. 9 million are dying every year because of cancer induced by the toxic chemicals sold by the same companies that made the chemicals for Hitler's Germany and are today selling them as agri-chemicals and make it look like there is no agriculture without it. And they called it the Green Revolution. Nothing green about it. It destroyed Punjab. It is what made me start looking at agriculture. We have an extinction crisis because of these chemicals whose only purpose is to kill. First human beings. Now every insect, every plant is a threat that must be exterminated. No wonder 80% species disappear. And then the pandemic of inequality, the 1% versus the 99%, and a genocidal iniquity. And behind it all is a common cause, the virus of greed, the virus of limitless growth, driven by limitless greed on a planet with limits, on a planet with democracy, on a planet requiring social justice. And my work since '84, when I started to look at the Green Revolution in Punjab after the violence there and the Bhopal disaster that killed thousands because of a pesticide plant leak in the city of Bhopal, what I have found is no matter which of these pandemics you look at, an industrial globalized agriculture is behind it. The last 30 years was years of deregulation. of the food system, with intellectual property rights laws written by Monsanto. They literally drafted, we were the patient, diagnostician, physician, all in one, they said. And I'm so glad to report that they've just lost a case in Argentina, and I was invited to be an amicus, because Argentina has law that says seeds are not patentable, as India does. And yet they go on threatening governments, saying, you've got to change your law so that we can take patents. And the same issue is there in the vaccine question. They've got patents on the coronavirus, on the genetically modified coronavirus, on the vaccines for the coronavirus, on the spike protein in the coronavirus. If you look at the family of patents hiding behind this tiny virus, you will realize how the greed virus is in absolute full force. Then we have the agriculture agreement, which basically tore down our food sovereignty laws. India had shaped a food sovereignty system because we came out of colonialism after the Great Bengal famine, which killed 62 million, but about 40 to 60 million had been killed through extractivism by the British, which transferred $45 trillion from India, leaving us in poverty and transferring the wealth. And then they created amazing theories from Adam Smith to Locke about how the spiritual labor of capital creates wealth, not the theft of colonialism. And the agriculture agreement basically meant that every acre of land could be grabbed by agribusiness in the Amazon to grow soya, burn the Amazon, displace the people. And to add it all, they then added a sanitary and phytosanitary agreement. I call it the junk food agreement. So Monsanto writes the intellectual property laws to patent seed. Cargill writes the free trade to destroy our food sovereignty. And the Pepsis and the Cokes and the Nestle's write the sanitary and phytosanitary agreement to destroy our health. 75% of the chronic diseases come from ultra-processed food. We know there are better ways. That's what the movement's been building. And that's what the People's Forum should build, both in Europe and in Asia. After all, in these years, we have found that we can grow more food by working with biodiversity. That's what we do in Vandana, the movement I started. We measure not yield per acre of commodities, but health and nutrition of the food that is produced. We found the links between the soil biodiversity, the plant biodiversity, the pollinator biodiversity, and our health. Biodiversity is health. We have found that in organic farming, by return the organic farming back to the soil, we can actually heal the broken carbon and nitrogen cycles. In 10 years, we can reverse climate change. 10 gigatons is the potential of recycling through growing good food, regenerating biodiversity, and protecting the livelihoods of our small farmers, who too are a threatened species. And that is why the Indian farmers have been on the streets now for more than 4 months to defend their right to live, their right to feed 1.4 billion Indians. We know we have the solutions to all the pandemics through food sovereignty. But the same people who gave us the crisis are now continuing deregulation, financialization, and an expanded territory for the greed economy. If you look at how the emissions have built up, the USA is responsible for 40% excess global carbon dioxide emissions as of 2015, European Union 29%, the G8 nations 85%, the rich countries 92%. And they are the ones who continue to blame our practices, our numbers. Our glaciers in the mountains are not melting because the mountain people created emissions. The people in the Bay of Bengal are not dying because of their emissions. This is why climate justice is so important, and it hangs on the polluter pays principle. These are laws we wrote. The Convention on Biological Diversity. We wrote the UN framework on climate change at the Earth Summit. We adopted the 2 most significant principles of the polluter must pay and the precautionary principle. Today, what is the greed machine doing? Trying to knock the precautionary principle. 700 million is the bribe given by Gates for the new GMOs and the dismantling of biosafety laws in Europe. Net zero, another amazing trick. We'll continue to pollute. We who give 92%, will continue to pollute. but we will control your land, your forests, your farms through our fake accounting of a carbon trading system. This, sadly, is at the heart of the so-called Dasgupta Review on Biodiversity. I have dedicated my life since '87 to biodiversity, since I found the corporations wanted to own and patent the seed. There's no biodiversity, no life in that review. All that it has is how to make money while the planet is dying, how to make money while people are dying. They've talked about making biodiversity another asset in the portfolio of the rich, the super rich asset management firms, the Black Rocks who are 8.7 trillion, the Vanguards who are 7.2 trillion, and they've all grown in this period of deregulation. That's where the billionaires put their money, and now they own the corporations. But as we live through COVID, the Dasgupta Review on Biodiversity is talking about how to value human life. They're talking about health as part of human capital. And how do they define it? To measure the value of mortality and morbidity. In money terms, you have to cook up an abstracted, non-real person, a statistical life. And then this is what is used to measure the value of your life. But this statistical life is measured on the basis of your richness and your poverty and wealth. And so the rich are 15 times more valuable than the poor, and add to it the new patterns of the big tech, of the Googles and the Monsantos, turning us as human beings into users of their machines, which will give us a value through algorithms, through cryptocurrencies. This is the time for human solidarity to rise, to reclaim our humanity, to reclaim the planet, to stop the tricks of fake accounting and fake science, to stop the false solutions in the name of saving the planet. We have worked again and again and again, and you as a forum particularly, and I am here to offer you solidarity. It is time to reclaim our seats, to reclaim our food, to reclaim our land, to reclaim our minds, to reclaim our bodies, to reclaim our freedom. This is your moment. This is our moment. Thank you.
Great, Vandana. That was a brilliant overview of the interconnections between all the crises that we face and the common solidarity that we must build. So that was really, really brilliant. So the numbers continue to grow up. It's now 273, and I think people will be coming in more and more during the day. So the next speaker is very close to my heart and my mind politically, and the description of him refers to him as, this is Jeremy Corbyn, as the former leader of the Labour Party. But I mean, in a way, that gives the impression that he's a former leader, whereas actually, you know, on Saturday, we were on the streets of London, thousands and thousands. It was one of the biggest demonstrations there's been for a long time. And there was Jeremy, you know, at the forefront and making a most brilliant speech against the occupation of Gaza. And he's in a way even more visible, more, I mean, the press try and ignore him, but in terms of struggles and campaigns and the arguments of the left, he's still our leader. And so it's a huge pleasure to introduce him. I hope he's here. I haven't yet seen him, but I'm assuming he is. So Jeremy, huge solidarity and a great pleasure to introduce you. And he's also, I must say, his aspect of his current leadership is that he's founded the Peace and Justice Project, which is a very important resource for all of us and helps to link these different campaigns that Jeremy is one of the most inspiring spokespeople of. So, Jeremy.
Hilary, thank you so much. And thank you very much for inviting me today. I consider it an honour to be asked to join a platform with such fantastic speakers. And I'll come back to some environmental issues in a moment. But Vandana, your contribution was mind-blowing in the sense that you brought together all of the issues surrounding the future of our planet and our own existence. But I thought the most powerful point you made was to reclaim our minds, because to my view, environmental issues and environmental politics are, yes, a series of regulations, causes, equations, demands, and causes, but it's about your state of mind, and environment is a state of mind about how we live on this planet. And so I'll come back to that in a moment. As Hilary kindly said, after the general election of 2019, in which we sadly didn't win that election, we had a platform which included public ownership, green revolution, and a number of other very popular issues. We didn't win the election, and we now have a very right-wing Tory government that spends a lot of its energies waving flags and producing legislation which is designed to curtail or prevent protest within society. And they produced what they call a Defence and Security Review, which in one thin volume manages to cut overseas aid expenditure to the lowest level for a long time in proportionate terms, and increase arms expenditure by 24 billion, and at no stage address the real issues of insecurity, which are inequality, poverty, injustice, environmental damage, and disaster. And I think it's important that there be a basis on which the radical development of politics over the past 5 years, which we managed by using our resources from the Labour Party and from the unions and many others to develop a democratic policy-making process, was to establish the Project for Justice and Peace, which we founded and launched it in January of this year, when 500,000 people came on a global call to set it up. And I'll come back to the work we're doing on it in a moment. But the context in which we're all talking is, of course, the COVID crisis. And whilst it is beyond regrettable that we're not all meeting physically and able to talk to each other informally and hear our ideas and see that sort of creative development that comes from it. But the other point about the COVID crisis is that it has meant that people have thought the need to communicate by Zoom or whatever it means it is all around the world. And actually, amongst activists, there's a greater sense of internationalism, of globalized ideas than there was before. And so when we finally do return to meeting physically with each other, can we please also make sure that we include all those that for many, many good reasons cannot be at events, but nevertheless can contribute to them. Use the technology. That's what I believe should be there for us to use it. But the corona crisis has also thrown up the world's inequalities, thrown up the inequalities of healthcare, thrown up the dangers of contagion, and also thrown up the crude and crass way in which global corporations have made billions of dollars, pounds, whatever you want to measure it in, through this crisis. In Britain, there's been a fundamental shift of wealth from the poorest to the richest. The poorest have all suffered a loss of income. Furlough payments don't meet 100% of wages, and those in the informal sector have lost out totally. And around the world, the very wealthiest have become even wealthier as a result. And the power of Big Pharma to gain government funding in order to undertake the research into the coronavirus and produce the vaccines to hopefully stop it, have kept the patents. And the money they are making out of it is phenomenal. And so the big winners in all this are actually Big Pharma. And one of the policies I had in our manifesto in which we fought the election was to establish a publicly owned pharmaceutical company to manufacture generic medicines to undercut what Big Pharma is doing. I tell you, if you tangle with the power of the lobbying of big pharma and others, there's a big price to be paid as a result of that. And so the corona crisis has shown all this, and what is now happening in India is beyond appalling, what I'm hearing and what I'm seeing on our screens about the effects of the virus there and in other places. So there is no uniformity in the response. And the wealthiest countries in the world have been basically hoarding vaccines. And the big pharma companies are now making a great deal of money on selling those vaccines around the world. If ever there was a case for a global principle on healthcare as a point of as free at the point of need for everybody in the world, it's got to be now. And so we need to make that demand. There are so many things I could talk about, but I just want to say this about the two of the biggest issues we face at the present time. The political crisis in the Middle East, the political crisis in Myanmar, the political crisis in so many other places around the world is absolutely huge and very, very serious indeed. But the response is interesting. The Israeli bombing of Gaza and the West Bank has provoked a global response. As Hilary pointed out, on Saturday in London, we had probably 150,000 people came at a few days' notice. And that was matched by demonstrations all over the country and indeed all over the world, as people recognize the plight of the Palestinian people under occupation. But we need that same sense of solidarity for other people as well. Myanmar is a terrible example of what the power of the military can do. And it's also a history of the military and what they've done to the peoples of the country, the way they've sought to divide people on ethnic grounds, and the terrible plight of the Rohingya people who are now in refugee camps in Bangladesh. And I hope I'm wrong, but they look to me to be developing a horrible air of permanence. I hope to goodness that the military government is removed in Myanmar. The Rohingya people can return in safety and live in safety in the future. But that means a coming together of peoples, as it means a coming together of peoples all around the world. And in the light of all this, we now have global corporations getting more powerful. We have a redistribution of power and wealth from the poorest to the richest as an act of economic strategy and policy. And we have a food crisis around many parts of the world, where there are now more people in what the UN euphemistically calls food insecurity than there have been for a very long time. And at the extreme end of desperation, there are now more refugees around the world than there have ever been, ever, at any point in recorded history. 80 million people, the equivalent population of a very substantial country, are refugees around the world. And they are people that are desperate to survive and to make their mark and make their contribution to the world. And I think we have to have that global solidarity with them. And don't allow right-wing governments like our own in this country to treat refugees as enemies and a threat and send the navy out into the sea to stop them traveling, any more than the European Union countries have sent naval vessels into the Mediterranean, because it has to be the right of refugees, first to survive, and secondly to be able to live in safety. So our project is about acts of solidarity, with peoples around the world. And so we established it in order to give voice, and we've chosen 4 areas of work, big projects, all of them. And I'll go through them quickly. 1, media, information. media domination by a small number of global corporations, principally around Rupert Murdoch, Fox News, etc., but there are others. But also the control of social media by a very small number of corporations who basically decide whether we can communicate with each other. And I think we have to have a much more radical approach to information and media, because if we don't, then those corporations will decide who can talk to each other, what we can say to each other, and what information we can share with each other. And so we are working with campaigns on democracy reform, democracy in the media, and access to the media. And as an act of policy from our group, sharing all our events on as many independent media platforms as we can find. And so, for example, on Saturday evening after the big demonstration, a group called Double Down News, very good organization, had a 1-hour discussion with a number of people from around the world on Palestine. And it was effective, it was powerful, and it was informative, as we are doing this today on this global platform we've got for ourselves. The second area is environmental. We've expressed our solidarity with the Indian farmers, and the Indian farmers, to me, are heroic. They've organized the biggest ever strike in global history, 250 million people taking action in support of the farmers. And what are the farmers protesting about? Essentially, the plans of the Modi government to globalize agriculture, and I can see where all that will lead to. The loss of land of the smallest farmers, the inability of them to survive, and the already terrible suicide rate of Indian farmers will get worse as a result of that. So absolute solidarity with them. And that, again, has caught the global imagination. But where was the global media reporting of it at the height of its intensity? And what were the global media platforms doing other than closing down communication between the farmers and the rest of the community? And so solidarity with them. And our second project is environmental, building up to COP26. And I couldn't agree more with what Vandana said about environmental issues. I don't want to see a market in pollution. I don't want to see a market in trading of levels of pollution. What I want to see is a state of mind that recognizes we cannot exist without biodiversity. We cannot exist without the multiplicity of insects, plants, and animals, and that is where our very survival comes from. Continuous intensive agriculture leads to soil degradation, ultimately to lower yields on crops, whereas a more biodiverse system in the longer run leads to reasonable levels of production, reasonable levels of food supply, because you've got that biodiversity. And so global movement of rewilding some places, of sustainable agriculture, but above all of localized agriculture, is something that is very important. So our environmental work is also about campaigning on that. But if we only say to everybody, you've got to make the air cleaner, you've got to cut pollution and so on, I agree with all of that. But if you're threatening people's jobs and they can't see any future for themselves, then we're not going to get that support. Hence, the policy we developed of the Green Industrial Revolution, which was about developing sustainable agriculture, sustainable energy production, and sustainable industrial production. And that obviously is a huge issue and takes time, but you've got to take people with you on it. And that means constantly campaigning and working on environmental issues, but above all, working with communities, not against communities. You protect the environment when people want to protect the environment, rather than when you tell them that they have to do it. The third area is economic security. We're working with, obviously, trade unions, our trade union recognition campaigns. We supported the Amazon recognition campaign, and obviously we'll continue to do that, but also working with food banks and the right to food, because many people during the pandemic have discovered that what they thought was a secure job wasn't. What they thought was a secure income wasn't, and as a result of that, they have had to rely on food banks, of which there are thousands all around the country. But those food banks have kept people alive, have kept them fed, and it is about food security for the poorest people. But of course, it's really about economic justice, and that is why our campaigns are around economic justice, which means empowerment of people. And the last area is of international solidarity. I've mentioned some of the issues around the world. Fundamentally, it's about human rights all around the world, about discrimination, about the growth of racism, but it's also about understanding our global history. The Black Lives Matter protests have provoked something quite amazing around the world, quite amazing. A beginning of an understanding that the history so many of our children learn in so many schools all around the world is not really global history at all. It's a national history, it's a nationalistic history, and it often preaches supremacy of one people's over the other. So that re-examination of what the slave trade was about, who benefited from the slave trade, the point that Vandana was making, the wealth in the City of London that came from the slave trade, the wealth in the City of London that was dragged from the people of South Asia, Latin America, or what we now call Latin America, the Caribbean, of European colonial powers, is there for all to see. But we want our children to be able to understand that. So the teaching and understanding of global history and empowerment is something that is crucial. And I think many around the world saw in their own lives something of the Black Lives Matter movement when they saw the protests taking place. And so our project is about giving voice. And this Saturday, we've organised a Voice for Refugees event at 3 o'clock London time. The link is to the Peace and Justice Project, and register the corbynproject.com Voices of Refugees. I'll ask if our hosts will be kind enough to send all this around. And what we've done is arranged for refugees themselves from refugee camps around the world to be able to tell the world what their lives are like, what happened to them, and what they're trying to achieve in their lives. I think it's going to be a very powerful event, and it's part of all of us globally working together. There are many on this call that I've met on many occasions in many places all around the world, and this sense of international solidarity is what it's all about. And so our project is about doing that. Our cause is about bringing people together. And when people come together and achieve any kind of victory, they're so empowered by it that it goes on to the next, to the next, to the next. And we do build that peaceful, more sustainable world. And that surely is what we're about. And thank you so much for inviting me today. And thank you so much to all the other contributors for what they've said. Solidarity to all. Thank you.
And thanks, Jeremy, and thanks for being such an empowering leader and activist. And I think it's really important that the Peace and Justice Project is now a new partner of the AEPF, and that we promote each other as much as we can. I think your contribution is really, it's really, along with Vandana's and everybody else's, it's bringing out a theme to this APF, which is, in a way, the politics of the economy of greed is on the march, is really escalating, and that therefore we've got to intensify our development of a politics of need, which in a way some of and others have been in the forefront of developing on the ground. But I think that's the task of this APF, an economics of facing an economics of greed. We've got to develop a politics, which also means an economics of need. So thanks, Jeremy, and thanks for developing the Peace and Justice Project.
My pleasure. Thank you, Hilary.
So the next speaker is Charles Santiago, who's in a very interesting position of both being, he's a Malaysian MP for the Democratic Action Party, and chairperson of the ASEAN Parliamentarians for Human Rights and a member of the AEPF International Organising Committee. So in Britain, particularly as we hoped, Jeremy and John McDonnell would be becoming part of a radical Labour government, we have this phrase, in and against the state. So being in the institutions, but maintaining an autonomous movement which had the power to struggle against those institutions. So Charles Santiago seems to be in that in and against position vis-a-vis ASEAN, with his base in the APF and the movements. So Charles, maybe you can say something about this experience and the challenges that we face.
Thank you, thanks. Thanks, Hilary, for the kind introduction. Let me begin by extending my three-finger salute to the brave people of Myanmar. And I also extend my greetings of peace and solidarity to all those fellow speakers, as well as all those who are in the forum. My presentation will focus on two sets of issues. One, on the politics of COVID-19 emergency powers, and then number two, the vaccine rollout, profits over right to life. This is in some way to respond to Hilary's inside-outside approach to politics. Let me begin by making the first point, the politics of COVID-19 emergency powers. For all the viewers here, I'm going to focus largely on the developments in Southeast Asia, which I know better. I'm sorry to start with dread, despair, and death, but I can't get images of corpses burning in open car park in New Delhi, Mumbai, and other parts of India out of my head. The depth of grief, helplessness, and hopelessness brought about by the coronavirus, not just in India, but other parts of the world as well, has rocked mine. Just like me, I'm sure many of you who are watching this forum feel frustration, anger, and also fear at incompetent governments and the scale of devastation because of the pandemic. I am an opposition member of the Malaysian Parliament and one of the people who were vaccinated at the early stages of the vaccine rollout. But we haven't been to work. Parliament is suspended with the Prime Minister, fearing it could create a new cluster of infections. Shops and restaurants are open. Parliament is suspended. Shops and restaurants remain open. People can commute to work with relevant documents. There is no halt to economic activities, and even kindergartens have resumed classes. You can still get your haircut and nails done, but lawmakers who are fully vaccinated must stay at home. So clearly, the Malaysian Prime Minister is using COVID-19 as an excuse to stay in power. Those of you who are familiar with Malaysian politics will know that party defections a few months ago led to the collapse of an elected government. There was a coup d'etat. The Prime Minister quickly declared an emergency and suspended the August House when it became apparent that he had lost the numbers to lead. We are now on our third lockdown, clearly indicating that the emergency powers has failed to contain infections. But the Prime Minister has dismissed growing calls to reconvene Parliament. And from the first lockdown in March last year till now, we have seen the rise of the use of preventive flaws, such as the Sedition Act and Communications and Multimedia Act, to silence dissent. Activists, artists, students, and opposition politicians are regularly called in for police investigation for legitimate protest or voicing their opinion. I too have been called more than once. Such incidences demonstrate the shrinking democratic space in the country and transgression of the freedom of expression. Media organizations are also not being spared. Last year, the hauling of Al Jazeera's journalists to the police station for a report on abuse of power by immigration officers during a raid on migrant workers and refugees sent a chill among media workers. The anti-fake news took a further whack on the right to information, freedom of information, and media freedom. It prevents journalists from doing their job. We are seeing a similar trend in much of Southeast Asia. In the Philippines, there is not just a lockdown on people's movements, but also a lockdown on rights. It's one of the worst hit countries in the region, with more than 1 million cases and almost 18,000 deaths linked to COVID-19. And yet, President Duterte has used the pandemic to entrench his position despite accusations of human rights violations against his government. Early last year, the party ordered the police and military to shoot dead anyone found to be violating COVID-19 restrictions. He also threatened to declare martial law in the country. One of his senators warned he had enough body bags for drug addicts and the peddlers of fake news. In both my country and the Philippines, my country, Malaysia and the Philippines, the description of fake news is similar. Criticism against the government, however legitimate, is fake news. Yet, it's not only in Malaysia or the Philippines where we have seen the checks and balances of parliament be sidestepped amid the pandemic. Thailand has now had a state of emergency in place for more than a year, apparently to deal with the health emergency, COVID emergency. This emergency also bypassed parliamentary scrutiny, with extensions of debate requiring only support from the Council of Ministers, a violation of international standards. Thailand's state of emergency has been used as an excuse to crack down on fundamental freedoms, particularly amid the rise in anti-government demonstrations in the country, which have called for major changes in Thailand's political order. According to World Prison Brief, 20% of the 380 detainees nationwide in Thailand are political prisoners. They are either pro-democracy protesters or those held for insulting the monarchy. It's disturbing to note that whether it is Malaysia, Thailand, the Philippines, Myanmar, or Cambodia, COVID-19 has had a significant impact on human rights and democracy, with governments using the pandemic as an excuse to further restrict freedom of expression, crack down on government critiques, and in order to strengthen the positions of power. It has been clear in recent years that democracy is under threat here in Southeast Asia. However, it is worsened by the COVID-19 health emergency powers. But however, it is not all doom and gloom, however. Where we have seen authoritarian regimes strengthen their power, we also witness civil society and grassroots movements rise up against it. Just look at the incredible scenes we are currently witnessing in Myanmar, where people are taking to the streets on a daily basis to face off against a violent military to demand democracy. But it's not only happening there. We also witness a remarkable pro-democracy movement in Thailand, where there are strong civil societies in other countries where democracy is at threat, including Philippines, Cambodia, and in Malaysia as well. Second point I would like to raise, as I said earlier, is to the vaccine rollout, profits over the right to life. In contrast to the developed world, vaccine rollout has been alarmingly slow in Southeast Asia. In Malaysia, only close to 6% of its population have been vaccinated at least once. This is because pharmaceutical companies prioritize rich countries over poor countries. But is Malaysia the only country that is seeing a slow progression of vaccine rollout? The answer is no. Sadly, vaccine rollout has been alarmingly slow in much of Southeast Asia. Only Singapore, the region's wealthiest country, is on course for widespread coverage, with about 30% of its population having received at least one dose of the vaccine. The rest of the region is significantly lower. Most other countries in the region, including Laos, Cambodia, the Philippines, and Indonesia, are expected to remain unvaccinated for at least 2 more years. When it comes to vaccine distribution and coverage for countries, there's also a glaring gap globally. Wealthier countries, usually in the Western world, are grabbing the vast proportion of vaccines for themselves at the expense of poorer countries that are part of the global South. Rich nations, representing about 16% of the world population, have procured 60% of the leading vaccines, enough to vaccinate their population 3 times over. But one thing is certain: monopoly of COVID-19 vaccine productions by big pharma and bargaining power by rich countries have resulted in pitting countries and citizens against each other. It's really time for us to understand the vaccine war that's happening between the World Health Organizations, between big countries, poorer countries, big pharma, and even US President Joe Biden. And this is very real and affects us at a personal level. While Biden has shifted his stance to throw his support behind intellectual property rights waiver, big pharma are going for his jugulars. The irony of it is that while pharmaceutical industries have managed to ride its monopoly rule into the trade-related intellectual property rights, or TRIPS, forcing compliance from every country, the funds for vaccine development comes largely from public sector and the taxpayer. But bargaining power of countries with deep pockets and industries penchant for selling to the highest bidder has resulted in a low-risk British citizen getting a first rollout of vaccines compared to a senior citizen with high comorbidities in Kuala Lumpur, Bangkok, Manila, or Vientiane. Despite more than 120 countries supporting the waiver, including Indonesia, Spain, and even China, we haven't heard much from ASEAN leaders, including Malaysia, except for Indonesia and Singapore. Indonesia has supported the waiver, whereas Singapore is against the waiver, but supporting an exemption for the World Trade Organization, IPR rules protecting vaccine production. This waiver would allow governments in ASEAN and the developing world to authorize production of patent vaccine without the consent of pharmaceutical companies holding the patent. We can also bypass the monopoly of companies holding intellectual property rights and produce generic vaccine and other technologies that can fight COVID-19. On the ground, this would mean our vaccination schedules can run smoothly. Let me stop and ask you a question here. Don't you think it's ironic, or rather fishy, that leaders in the region are holding on to emergency powers and other oppressive laws that has failed to stop the infections, but won't lend their support for the vaccine waiver? And if I take a step back and look at this, ASEAN leaders come across just as bad as the big pharma who holds on to the patent which allows them legitimacy to produce the vaccine for the next 20 years. The only difference is that our leaders want the power to rule, while big pharma remains seduced by profits that run into billions of dollars. This is despite the dread, despite the despair, despite the death. This is in spite of the possibility. This is despite of the possibility that poor countries could turn into massive graveyards, just like what's happening in India. As of mid-May, the pandemic has spread to 6 continents. More than 3 million people have died. The United States, Brazil, India, and Mexico remain the worst hit countries. The rapid development of vaccines to combat COVID-19 has been a monumental achievement for science. But unfortunately, we are seeing nationalistic policies coupled with corporate greed by pharmaceutical companies that are preventing these much-needed vaccines from achieving global reach. Big Pharma is fighting against a proposal that has been backed by the United States to lift intellectual property rights for coronavirus vaccines, which would rapidly scale up the number being produced globally, and thus speed up how quickly they can be distributed around the world, particularly to poor countries in the global south. Big Pharma and its powerful lobby claims that the issue is a complex one, and one that such a waiver would do nothing to speed up the distribution of vaccine. Let's be entirely clear. This is nothing but corporate greed. Such a strategy focuses on profiting during a pandemic as opposed to saving people's lives. Big Pharma and its backers continue along this path of blocking global access to a vaccine, then they will have blood on their hands. Does Big Pharma really want to be directly responsible for hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions more deaths? Does it really want to be responsible for the potential crime against humanity? Extraordinary times calls for extraordinary measures, and these pharmaceutical companies must put their profits and the interests of their shareholders aside and ensure this waiver goes through so that the vaccine can be distributed more freely and equitably. It is not the only right thing to do, but the smart thing to do. Allowing large parts of the planet to remain unvaccinated for many more years risk allowing the virus to keep spreading, including the risk of mutation that could devastate further our economies, job losses, and livelihood. At the beginning of the crisis, we heard the mantra that we were all in this together. This crisis is still not over for so many of us, and we need the same spirit of unity globally in order for the world to move past this pandemic as quickly as possible. But we are experiencing nothing short of a moral bankruptcy as profits continue to motivate Big Pharma. This is an infringement of the right to life. where supporting public health is crucial, especially during a pandemic, as it allows us to live with human dignity. It's also not just criminal, but a crime against humanity and a grave infringement of human rights. The UN Subcommission for the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights has contended that human rights should enjoy primacy over patents. But patent laws and intellectual property rights, like those enjoyed by Pfizer, AstraZeneca, Moderna, and other vaccine providers, restrict a person's right to health as stated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So, my friends, I leave you with this question. Should we drag the big pharmaceutical companies to the International Criminal Court for the crime against humanity? Thank you, and thanks for your attention.
Thanks, Charles. That's a really interesting and good challenge that we should discuss. I mean, thanks for that focus on corporate power as the sort of enemy of people's health and of the environment. And that leads us on to the next speaker, who's going to be talking exactly about the global struggle for both climate and economic justice, and presumably will carry on that focus on the struggle against the corporations. So the next and final speaker in this panel, but this is all going to stimulate discussion throughout the week, is Lidy Nacpil, who's in a very good position to talk about these issues as coordinator of the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development and co-founder of the global campaign to demand climate justice and the fight against inequality. And she's also a member of the AEPF International Organizing Committee. So she's the last speaker, and then Hamid will ask a question and I might ask a question just to get discussion between the panelists. And then there won't be time for a full Q&A, but we'll be going into different sessions where there'll be maximum participation, leading eventually towards a plenary where there will also be a lot of discussion. So Lidy, over to you.
Thank you, Hilary. As the other speakers have actually very clearly articulated, we are now in a period that will go down in history as one of the most horrific years for humanity. As we all struggle to survive and overcome COVID and its impacts, we also battle other crises, deepening economic injustice, intensified state repression and violence in many countries, and an escalating climate crisis. The climate crisis exposes the fundamental flaws of the dominant global economic system. Capitalism is a system that involves the unrestrained extraction of natural resources, the destruction of ecosystems, the overproduction of commodities, the pursuit of hegemony by corporations, the elite capture of states, geomilitary and political conflicts, and the dependence on the use of fossil fuels for all of these, all for the relentless pursuit of profit. This system, capitalism, has resulted in the excessive and rapidly increasing concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, the steepest rise occurring in the era of neoliberal capitalism. The fight against climate change is a fight against the very same system that has taken inequalities, class contradictions, patriarchy, racism, exploitation, and human suffering to great heights and intensity. We are now at the threshold of the most critical decade for climate action. What the world will do in the next few years will determine if we can still keep global warming to below 1.5 degrees. As we struggle to overhaul the system, we also need to win specific changes in the short term, without which we will not succeed in stopping climate change. We need to force governments and corporations to make changes in their policies and operations now. In recent weeks, several governments of the world's largest economies issued their latest climate targets. These targets have to be evaluated in the light of the requirements for keeping global temperature rise to below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Climate targets must be based on science and the fair sharing of global climate actions based on historical and continuing responsibility for the excessive greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. It is imperative for the rich industrialized countries to achieve real zero by 2030 and the rest of the world before or by 2050. The fair shares of rich industrialized countries include domestic actions to reach real zero, plus the delivery of climate finance to meet the balance of their share in mitigation, as well as cover the costs of adaptation and loss and damage. By these metrics, most governments are failing. For instance, the Biden government target is to reduce emissions by 50 to 52% below 2005 levels by the year 2030. Climate campaigners in the US have calculated that the US must deliver 195%, not 52%, reduction of emissions based on 2005 levels by 2030. As the world's largest historical emitter, the US failure to deliver its full share will mean the world will not stand a chance. The UK's most recent pronouncement is emissions reduction of 68% from 1990 levels by 2030. According to our climate campaigners in the UK fair share of greenhouse gas emissions reduction is 200%, not 68%, reduction from 1990 levels by the year 2030. We are hearing announcements from governments about so-called net zero targets, which Vandana has referred to, or climate neutrality. We need to actively debunk these net zero targets. Net zero includes unreliable, dangerous technologies that serve as deceptive distractions from achieving real zero. Governments of rich countries refuse to meet their full obligations of climate finance also. The little climate finance being delivered is so far below the minimum $100 billion a year target of the Paris Agreement, and even further below the trillions based on actual need. These rich countries give these meager amounts, many in the form of loans, as if these are generous assistance for countries of the South. Climate finance is not assistance nor aid. It is part of the reparations for the huge climate debt owed by their governments, elites, and corporations. And climate debt is only part of a much bigger historical, social, and ecological debt acquired through centuries of plunder, exploitation, and destruction. And this debt is still being accumulated today and is many, many times bigger than the financial debts they are forcing our people to pay. We are not absolving governments, elites, and corporations in the South. They have collaborated with global elites and corporations in perpetuating the capitalist system. They unleash state and private armed forces against our people and communities who defend the system and their own interests. They too must undertake their fair share of climate actions and pay their climate debts. Climate actions must include the swift end to fossil fuels, full-scale ecological restoration, the shift away from extractivist economies, and a just transition for workers, for communities, and for all people as a core component. To bring a swift end to the fossil fuel industry, we must challenge governments, but we also need to confront fossil fuel corporations directly, as well as their financiers and investors and their allied industries. In the last few years, some incremental changes have been achieved in the policies of some governments, institutions, and corporations. These are a testament to the power of collective action by movements, local communities, and civil society groups. We need to keep on pushing to demand more and demand faster action. The tide is turning on coal, but the fight has to be won completely. And we have to simultaneously wage the much more complex fight to end fossil gas and oil. The urgency it's not just about stopping climate change in its tracks. We have to also adapt, build resilience, and brace ourselves for already irreversible change and impacts. At nearly 1 degree centigrade warming since capitalism began, we are already experiencing devastating consequences. The capitalist system is rendering billions of people hungry because of inequalities and poverty, and economies which produce for world markets and not for what people need. Climate change is deeply exacerbating these conditions. It undermines our ability to produce food given the impacts on weather, on land and oceans. We need a fundamental change in the use and control of resources and in what we produce and for whom and how. Primacy must be given to sustainable production of staple food for domestic consumption, address inequity in access, change financial systems that result in soaring food prices. We need to dismantle agro-industrial complexes and protect the rights and welfare of farmers and fishers. Throughout the fight against climate change, against capitalism, we must also remember there cannot be economic and climate justice without gender justice, without racial justice, without justice for indigenous peoples and all who struggle with multiple layers of oppression. Now more than ever, in the face of this multiple crisis and the urgency of system change, we are challenged to build and exercise the power of collective action in different fronts, at various forms and arenas, raising the scale, intensity, and boldness of our actions to overcome capitalism and build a better world. Thank you.
Thanks, Lidy. That was a really good, almost manifesto of what could be done that I hope will then feed into the discussions of the next week, and maybe, you know, different workshops can elaborate on the basic framework that you've laid out. So I'll hand over to Hamid to just get the discussion going. Hamid.
Thank you, Hilary. And I must congratulate all the speakers. All of them made excellent presentations and highlighted some very important point. And my question is to Mr. Jeremy Corbyn. He actually emphasized on human rights violations all over the world. And he mentioned the situation in Gaza and Myanmar, and also mentioned Rohingya. And he touched the plight of the Indian farmers. But my question is that what role United Nations can play to stop Israel and the military regime of Myanmar to stop their human rights violations? Is UN in a position to do anything?
Shall I deal with that now, Hilary?
Yeah, should I repeat my question?
No, I've got the question, thank you. I've got the question, thank you very much. Well, obviously the UN must and should condemn what has happened in Myanmar, and that they have done. I suspect there is a global reluctance to do too much because of the role of China, Russia, USA, etc. in all of this. And I am supportive of the popular movement against the military government, and indeed had a fascinating call with one of the leaders of the clothing workers unions in Myanmar, who the unions were fighting back against it. And I was very pleased with the contribution that we had at the start of this from Sai Sam about the way in which attitudes have changed towards the Rohingya and other groups within Myanmar. Can the UN do more? Yes, of course it can do far more. It could be much more involved with human rights monitors on the scene. It could be much more involved with a much stronger declaration from the Security Council. It could be much more involved with much stronger pressure on the ASEAN countries as well to cease their cooperation with the military regime, and of course to the rest of the world as well, because the military regime is a product of the almost, well, you know better than me, but almost complete independence of the military from any kind of democratic society, running their own businesses, their own sources of income and everything else. That has to be challenged. That military structure has to be challenged. Otherwise, we might get some kind of cosmetic return to democracy, but the same imbalance of power will continue afterwards. And so it is about a fundamental shift that I believe is necessary to bring about any kind of democratic society.
Thank you, Hilary.
So, Hamid, shall I ask a question?
Yes, you can. You can,
Okay.
please.
Okay, so I was wondering, you know, everybody's rightly emphasized the importance of our collective power, as well as putting demands on governments. And in thinking about our collective power, I was wondering, you know, thinking about the different components of the coalitions we need to build. I was wondering if any of the panelists have got ideas about the role that the trade unions, the working class organizations at the point of production, which, you know, I'm not saying are like the, you know, they're not the supreme source of power, but they are a particularly important source of power, particularly in the process of challenging the corporations, in terms of the process of a just transition to a low carbon economy. And maybe it's a question to all the panelists. You know, what from your experiences are the is the potential of the trade unions, and what needs to be done? I mean, what both demands and also organizing strategies would you suggest? Because clearly at the moment the trade unions, sometimes at a local level there's good initiatives, but often it's rather rhetorical at a national level. So any thoughts on this? Maybe starting with Vandana.
Yeah. I think the first is the corporations have broken their silos. Big tech has joined with big biotech, has joined with big ag and big pharma to basically take over our food system and our health system. And the two are deeply connected. It is also time for us to break out of our silos and have stronger organizational solidarity. We did this in Seattle. You know, I was part of the whole International Forum on Globalization, and we stopped the WTO ministerial meeting in Seattle because the trade unions and the environmentalists and the youth and the farmers all came together to say our world is not for sale. I think the challenge for us right now, given how the greed is redefining the green recovery and the great reset, you will own nothing and you will rent everything. Well, if we've got to rent everything, what kind of debt are we creating among people who have nothing? And therefore you are working on a system. I mean, the farmers who died in India for famine was because there was a rent collection, because the British declared our land as theirs and then collected rents. We saw how this led to famine. Rent collection is what is led to the suicides, 400,000 farmers' suicides for paying debt for seeds and chemicals. And even on the vaccine question that Charles raised, this is basically creating a debt economy where nothing is with the people. There are no commons, there are no public goods. Everything is in the hands of the billionaires, their asset management funds, and the corporations they control. This is something we must collectively challenge. So of course, no patents on vaccines because they are a public good. They were financed by public research in public universities. If you look at the map of patents, all the research was actually done by the university system. And the company came in towards the end. And this is how Bill Gates is taking over. How is he taking over the seed? He didn't collect those seeds. Those seeds were stolen from India and other countries by the World Bank and the CGIAR system to create an ERI in Philippines, to create a CGIAR system across the world, CIMIT in Mexico. Right now, this year, Gates is given tiny bits of funding to take over the entire seed collections, and then is trying to use genomic maps, digital genomic maps, to take control over the seed. But just like drawing a map in the sand of the Middle East left the legacy of conflicts we are witnessing and the continuous wars, including the current problems right now, the genocide of Palestine. Map making is a colonial empire building. And he has admitted very clearly that digital genomic mapping will is his way of undermining the slowness of UN negotiations, of the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Kyoto Protocol on Access, as well as the FAO Treaty. So all this is being done to dismantle the UN system. We have to defend the UN and give it a backbone. The WHO was already privatized, and so many of the problems that Charles laid out are related to the privatization of the WHO. Right now, the FAO is being privatized, the food summit, which is always held in Rome, and there was one country, one vote in the UN, has been taken to New York, where there's a billionaire and his vote. The Alliance for the Green Revolution chief, Agnes, is heading the food summit of the world. And through this, they are preparing the whole new food economy. We must defend the UN as a public system where one country has one vote. We have to defend our national governments, which are also being privatized and being reduced to not just, if the age of neoliberal globalization created corporate states, the COVID period is creating corporate surveillance states, working on behalf of corporations, taking all the public goods, diverting it to the corporations and the billionaires, who are then establishing stakeholder dialogues instead of democratic rights of the unions and everyone else, and public-private partnerships, basically to deregulate, redirect public money to corporate subsidies and reduce the risks. They're talking about zero-cost economies. And I think one of the things we could definitely do between Europe and Asia is go back to colonialism. The limited liability corporation was created with the East India Company to socialize risks. If the ships didn't come back, the society bore the cost. But if they did, then the 300 merchant adventurers got all the money. They're now talking about zero-cost economies of zero risk. It's the public that pays, the environment that pays, and workers pay. Why are the workers the most important at this point? Because there is an imagination of an end of work, that artificial intelligence and robotics will replace the troublesome workers. The rest will be living in really bad conditions under authoritarian rule. I mean, one of the things that was done by one of the states as part of COVID was get rid of labor rights and then say, now we'll robotize our factories. And whoever will work will work with no rights at all. So solidarity among all the sectors, we can't afford to be divided. We are one humanity on one planet, and we have to have a deep solidarity with the earth, and we have to have a deep solidarity with each other across geographies and across sectors.
Thank you. I would like to ask a question to Shi Meng, and I request her to be very brief because we are short of time. Shi Meng, you are raising voice for the recovery of your husband, Mr. Sumbat, since last many years. Can you tell us what is the position of international law regarding these enforced disappearances, and what role the elected parliaments in Asia and Europe can play against these enforced disappearances all over the world?
Thank you. I've been struggling for the past 9 years, but the past 9 years have also shown me how powerless the countries, either the EU and countries are to demand justice of authoritarian governments who abduct their citizens. And it is not only Sombat, it's very clear to me in my work against enforced disappearances that the resolution of enforced disappearance cases is very, very difficult because national governments are sovereign. You can apply pressure. The UN has applied pressure. That's the United Nations International Convention against involuntary and enforced disappearances. Many countries have signed up, but many countries in Asia have not adopted that convention. And even if they have, like in Cambodia, people go missing and are disappeared in Cambodia with no resolution. So my quick answer to you is many of the victims remain powerless in face of the authoritarian governments who, violate the rights of their citizens by removing them and not giving their family any answers. There are many, many thousands of people who have been disappeared in this way all across Asia, and we have no resolution. It is a very sad state of affair. I don't know what countries can do. I don't know what the EU can do. Somebody was disappeared because he co-chaired the AEPF. And what can AEPF do? Frankly, I don't have an answer.
Well, I asked this question because today the Pakistani government will present a draft of the bill against enforced disappearances in the parliament. And there was a pressure from the European Union on Pakistani government for legislation on child labor and against enforced disappearances. So I think that EU can play some role.
Hamid, can I comment on this?
Yes, please.
2 weeks ago, the European Union had a big forum on the latest human rights strategy for Southeast Asia and for Asia in general. And it was impressed that forced disappearance should be part of the human rights plan of the European Union. And in that context, Sombat's name was raised, including others in Thailand who also disappeared. So I just think that Sombat, although might not be with us right now, but the implications of what has transpired has keeping European Union and other governments on top of the forced disappearance issue. So I think there are a lot of things that actually has developed positive as a result of what happened in 2012. But let me also take advantage of these 2 minutes and respond to some of the issues that Hilary raised earlier, though. I think one of the ironies of the pandemic, real ironies of the pandemic, is one where at this time we see people losing jobs by the millions, people are in debt by the millions, how people are unable to pay rent, small businesses closing by the millions. But at the same time, you have billionaires who have become trillionaires on the other side. Now, how is this possible? How is this millionaires have become billionaires and trillionaires, millionaires have become trillionaires? So you can see this accumulation of wealth at a time of pandemic seems to be at the highest level possible. So this shows how rotten the system is, how rotten to the core the system is. The point number 3 is I want to respond to the issue of Myanmar. The recent meeting that took place in Jakarta, where you had the ASEAN leaders meeting. And at that meeting, I think there were lots of mistakes done by the ASEAN governments. One, they should have consulted and brought in the National Unity Government as part of the process. In fact, they actually invited online the most hated man in Myanmar to be part of the decision making. And after having made the decisions with the head of government, he goes back and forgets all the decisions that he had made with ASEAN governments. One, he said there'll be no violence. The community 5-point consensus was there'll be no violence. But now violence is not only violence, you have planes that are dropping bombs in the Shan
Okay.
state, Kachin state, and so on and so forth. So you find that essentially the Myanmar government took, the Myanmar army took the ASEAN government for a ride. In fact, they're seeing a replay of what happened in the Rakhine state. It
Okay.
took 2 years to get the thing organized, but ASEAN governments couldn't rein in Ming on life. So I think really here ASEAN was cheated.
Yes, Hilary, would you like to ask some question?
Well, I'm thinking we've got to end at 11 o'clock. So
Yes.
we've only got 13 minutes. So I was thinking maybe we should ask everybody who wants to, I mean, everybody on the panel, if they want to make any final points. And then we should tell people that they can register on the set, not register, they can link to the Tuesday plenary on the same link as for this one. And maybe Dottie, we could, just after everybody's spoken, you could say something about other, other features of the week. You know, what's happening in terms of any workshops or sort of specific sections. So maybe if we ask everybody to just give a comment that hasn't spoken recently or that has got other things to say, very briefly. We've only got 13 minutes, so there's quite a few of you. So just a 3-minute comment would be great. I don't know, starting with Shuming, and then going on to Sai Sam, because a lot of issues have been raised about Myanmar, and then maybe Jeremy, and then well, Vandana, if you've got more to say, and Charles too. So and then on to Dottie. So Shuming, anything more to say? I think you're on mute.
I don't think I have much more to add. I am just thankful for the comments of Hamid and Charles that the EU is taking on enforced disappearance in their human rights work. I think it is really important that the victims of enforced disappearances get truth and justice. And I think we can look forward to resolution for some of the cases. Thank you.
Okay, Sai Sam.
Thank you for having this opportunity to say a few concluding remarks. I would like to say that what Myanmar is facing is a multiple crisis. It's not only coup d'etat, as many panelists has already pointed out. We have climate crisis. Myanmar have cyclone and all sorts of extreme climate events that affected livelihoods of the Myanmar people. And as a grassroots mobilizer, as someone who worked closely with the agrarian communities in Myanmar, I have seen also a lot of land grabs and different issues coming with capitalism. And Myanmar is also an important country for China's ambitious Belt and Road Initiative. So these are come together at the same time. And then we still have COVID-19. So these are the nature that Myanmar is facing. I think, but it does not mean that Myanmar is a country that is only, in trouble. It's also inspire the neighboring country and to the world. And I think what we got from this crisis is realization that this is our struggle and we really have to fight it. And the other thing is we are seeing immense solidarity being shown to Myanmar. I think these are very, very important and encouraging aspect of that. And I would finally would like to say that the Selwyn Peace Park in the southern part of Myanmar it won the Equator Award, It is a grassroots indigenous mobilization about conserving the areas and also, contributing to counter climate change in Myanmar. And these are important examples that we should not overlook. When we look at Myanmar, it's not only a country with crisis, but there are also examples that people can look from, in contrast with the capitalist approach to solve the global climate issues. Thank you very much.
Okay, Jeremy, is there anything more you want to add?
Thanks, Hilary. I'll be very brief because it's other voices that need to be heard. Thank you to you for hosting this event, and thank you to so many friends I've seen on this, including my old friend Professor Chenoy, and I have happy memories of speaking with him at JNU and many others. And the work that you and others all did for the World Social Forum was an amazing experience. But we have to get a message out across the world. And there's 2 points I'd like to mention. One is the question on the role of trade unions is a very important one, because people join unions basically for defensive reasons, to defend living standards, to defend wages, to defend jobs, and then move on to assertion to try and gain higher levels of income and so on. But unions also have a very, very important social role in society. And I think we need to move to the principle that people join a union as a social organization, which is not just focused on the workplace, but is also focused on the wider society. Unions can help with education, can help with mobilization, can help with determination of policy, and can protect and increase jobs, and at the same time protect the environment. And so there are huge issues there. And my whole life has been a member of a trade union. And I used to be a trade union organizer before I became a member of parliament. And I think working with unions is something that is very, very important. And last week, I had a meeting with the organizers for the International Transport Federation all around the world. Absolutely fascinating discussion. One thing that came out was the way seafarers have been criminalized for saving refugee lives because they have been accused by various governments of aiding and abetting illegal migration. The law of the sea says a seafarer must protect all human life in peril on the sea. That's what the law says. So the unions are obviously defending them. And that, of course, is then a lesson of solidarity with refugees around the world. On the question of disappeared people, Shui, thank you so much for what you said, the way you said it, and the determination of the campaign, and absolute solidarity with you. The numbers of disappeared peoples around the world is increasing, and tracing them, finding them, and illegal organizations that abduct people is absolutely horrific. And I've been at many meetings of the UN Human Rights Council and others on disappeared people. And it's right that the national governments, generally speaking, protect their local police forces, their regional police forces, or the often corrupt relationship between narco gangs, for example, and those forces. And so it is about breaking that. Having that sense of inquiry and solidarity is vitally important. And I do take up individual cases of people that have disappeared, where there's usually some kind of connection with my constituency or something in Latin America and other places, and we all have to do that. I'll just finish with this because as ever, these calls are too short and there's so much more to say, but I think we've this morning set a very good scene about the crucial issues of protecting and sustaining the environment of our world, not commercialize environmental politics, but mobilize on that understanding that if we don't protect our natural world and our natural environment, then from those that seek to destroy it by greed and free market capitalism, then obviously there's doom ahead for the next generation. I want to create a planet that's fit for the next generation. We do that by imagination, by mobilization, by organization. And in every child, there is imagination. In every child, there is hope. In every child, there's music, there's poetry. Let's give them the space to dream and the space to achieve for all of us. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy. An inspiring note to carry on and be kind of enthused for this whole conference. So, Vandana, is there more you want to say?
Just one little thing.
Yeah.
Charles talked about how millions lost livelihoods, jobs, businesses, and the billionaires became trillionaires. And there was in a chat box that 3.7 trillion was transferred from working people to the billionaires. Every bit of this transfer took place because of deregulation. I know this. India is a land of small businesses, small vendors who come to sell vegetables at your doorstep. We had a fight against Walmart, and we stopped them in retail, but Amazon managed at the peak of the Corona lockdown to get permission to be excluded from the lockdown and to do e-commerce. In the process, their market expanded. I think we have to really defend our regulations because deregulation is the name of greed. We've got to regulate greed. Every living and free system is regulated. Only greed is not, and they would like zero regulations. So let us be innovative and let's be creative to see what are the laws that exist that we can defend and where can we deepen and create new laws to rein back the rogues, because they are rogues.
Vandana, really good point. So, Lidy, anything more from you?
Yes, well, as a member of the International Organizing Committee, I'd really like to invite everyone to join all the different plenaries and workshops being scheduled this week. I think it's been a really engaging afternoon of sharing our thoughts on what the situation is. We need to spend also more time discussing our strategies and our actions, and we hope that this will be spaces for this in the coming week. Thank you.
Thanks, Lidy. And Charles, anything more to add?
Just a parting thought. I think we should fight tooth and nail to ensure that the vaccine waiver becomes a reality. Otherwise, millions will die. Thank you.
Okay, I think that's everybody. Hamid, why not some final thoughts from you before we hand over to Dottie? Hamid, I know you're a host, but maybe you've got something you want to kind of bring together.
Looks like he's dropped out.
Okay, so let's quickly go on to Dottie. Just to anything you want to add on the plans for the next week.
Yes, thank you, Hilary, and also Hamid, and all the wonderful speakers for all your very, very deep thoughts, your commitment, and all your wonderful and strong, inspiring speeches. Thank you all. For the next 6 days, we will have the thematic plenaries from all the clusters. So you will hear more of Lidy and also other speakers on the climate justice clusters, climate change and just transitions. So we will have the plenary tomorrow with the title Rising to the Challenges of this Most Critical Decade for Climate Justice, followed by the plenary on Wednesday coming from the food sovereignty cluster. So we will hear lessons of the Indian farmers movement. On Thursday, we will have the plenary from the Just Trade and Corporate Accountability Cluster to discuss the COVID-19 pandemic and the broken economic system. You will also have on Friday, the plenary from the Social Justice Cluster on income security options and choices, money, 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 but that is not all. So on Saturday, we will also have from the Peace and Security Cluster, we will hear about the situation and what needs to be done on peace and security in Asia and Europe. On Sunday, we have the plenary of the Democracy Cluster, and we will discuss about the right to dissent and that it must be at the heart of democracy. So thank you all. You can still use your link that you used today for all those plenaries. All daily plenaries will be from 9 to 11 CET, 10 to 12, no, 9 to 11 BST, 10 to 12 CET, and then all your corresponding time zone time equivalent. So we kept about 260 participants for today for an average of 1 hour 45 minutes, and you are all coming from 26 countries. That's really wonderful. So let's keep it, and then see you every day until Monday. And thanks to the crew. Thanks to Kunti, who translated from English to Khmer the whole 2 hours. That's tough. So thank you all. Take care, everyone, and see you again tomorrow.